live stream. Got it. Okay, unless I've actually got anything to say, other than hello to people, I'm going to mute ours.
Okay, thanks, Bob.
We're going to be video free this evening, as far as outgoing is concerned.
Okay, well, I think we're live. Good evening, everyone. Coming to you live from Cannon Beach, where we have had just an absolutely beautiful day, which it was a break. We had some gray days, but today, beautiful, absolutely gorgeous, wonderful sunset. So I'm a happy person this evening. And also, it was exciting. I saw my very first common mers fly up to Haystack Rock today. So that was really cool to see. And hopefully, tufted puffins aren't too far behind, which of course are one of our very favorite species with the Friends of Haystack Rock. And welcome everyone. My name is Hannah. I am a board member with the Friends of Haystack Rock, and I'm so glad you all joined us today to listen to Josh's talk about killer whales, which I'll turn it over to him in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to mention a couple things. So Facebook has this really cool tool that has captions that are live captions. Of course, they're not going to be absolutely perfect since it is computer done. And so if you need those to turn on, just make sure to click on the bottom where it says to turn on the captions. We will, of course, post this to our Facebook. This will live on our Facebook page, but we'll also post it to our YouTube channel when I get my act together. So if you would like to turn it to, send it to anyone, you can send them the Facebook link after this presentation, or you can go to our YouTube where it will be available as well. If you do have any questions throughout the talk, please just make sure to put those in the chat, and we will ask our presenter at the end of his talk those questions that you have. And we hope that you enjoy our talk. It is going to be excellent. I am really looking forward to it. I love talking about killer whales, and I know so many of you love listening about killer whales. And so I'll ask Josh to join us in just a second, but I just wanted to mention that he is a marine mammal scientist and graduate student at the University of British Columbia's Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries Marine Mammal Research Unit. And he's going to be sharing with us his talk, which is Ecological Aspects of Transient Killer Whales off the California and Oregon coast. So without further ado, Josh, take it away.
All right, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be chatting with you today. I'm just going to share my screen here. Get a presentation up. Here we go. Okay, yeah, so thanks for having me today, and I appreciate the introduction. I'm going to be speaking a little bit today about a species, a population that I'm very passionate about. These are killer whales, transient killer whales in general. I spent close to 15 years studying them, and up and down the Pacific coast. But today it's something special. I'm going to be discussing a little bit more about the Oregon and California region, which are kind of not as well known for killer whales. Most of the research has been done in Washington State, in British Columbia. Not a lot of information is known about the outer coast of these areas. So this photograph here on the side was taken by colleagues at the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center. And this was actually about 200 kilometers offshore of Newport Beach. So quite a ways out. And these are what we call transient killer whales, which I'll explain a little bit about what transient really means. But what were killer whales doing 200 kilometers off the shore of Newport is kind of what is exciting about this study and what we want to learn more about. So this project I've been currently working on, I'm at the University of British Columbia. I'm a master's student and a research scientist there, and we are currently trying to conduct this thesis work in collaboration with multiple different groups. This includes NOAA Fisheries, the National Marine Sanctuaries, particularly Monterey Bay, San Jose State University, Moss Landing Marine Laboratories, Marine Life Studies in Monterey, as well as Oregon State University. We collaborate quite often with a lot of the university researchers there as well. So this is a little bit about myself. As I mentioned, I'm from British Columbia, Vancouver Island, born and raised, but I spend a lot of my time now in Monterey doing field work just off the central coast of California. And every year I kind of make my way down the coast. My partner and I, we drive down the coast of Oregon into California, talking to naturalists and fishermen and whale watchers trying to get information about the animals, sightings, and then spending our time on the water. So first off, though, just a little bit of background information. So off the Oregon coast and California coast, we see a few different kinds of killer whales. And this is actually in the North Pacific in general. We call these ecotypes, which are genetically distinct groups of killer whales. So killer whales are one species, but we have these multiple different ecotypes that are kind of genetically diverging. They're kind of out on their own. They differ in their diet, their morphology. They differ in their social structure and behavior, as well as their acoustics. The first off, most of you know, are the resident killer whales, which are a salmon specialist. They're fish eaters, particularly Chinook salmon. So if you're on the outer coast, you might see a group, likely could be resident orcas. We know that K-pod and L-pod, part of the southern resident endangered population, frequently come down the coast and are seen off the Columbia River. You can see too their saddle patch. This is that gray area by the dorsal fin. Can either be open or closed. And what that really means is an open saddle has these kind of black pigments that kind of enter in. The dorsal fin very rounded. And then in transients, you can see this closed saddle. Transient orcas have never been identified with an open saddle pattern. So it's just a solid gray area. And then also you can see this very sharply pointed dorsal fin, typically in adult females. We see this distinctive characteristic. And then the third kind of killer whale, which is a very interesting ecotype, is what we call the offshores. And these killer whales are predominantly seen in offshore waters, seaward of the continental shelf. They're also fish eaters, believed to be fish eaters, in particular more higher trophic level hunters. So basically they have been known to feed on sharks. And they also have this very rounded dorsal fin. That saddle patch, though, can either be open or closed. So very similar to resident killer whales. Also, what's really interesting is with each killer whale here, we can actually photo identify individuals. So if you're on the water and you take a photograph of a killer whale and you were to email it to us, we can actually take a look and see these different scars, patterns on the dorsal fin, the shape of that saddle patch, these notches, are all these congenital features that stay with these animals their entire lives. So basically just similar to like a scar that we might have on our hand, or it's a similar pattern we can use for identifying individuals. But with transient killer whales, it gets a little bit more complicated. We have a few different populations in the northeastern Pacific, and kind of some of the focus of the work I'm conducting at UBC is kind of trying to figure out the community structure of one of these populations. But first, we have what is called the Gulf of Alaska population, which is now been reassigned to be called the Gulf of Alaska Aleutian Islands Bering Sea stock, based on NOAA's recent 2020 technical report. And you can see here that stock runs quite a far offshore. They've been sighted, but into the Gulf of Alaska, all the way down into Southeast Alaska. There's been a few sightings. They're also along the Aleutians and into the Bering Sea. Another population is this little blue dot called the AT1s, or the Chugach transients, and they're predominantly sighted in the waters of Prince William Sound, the Kenai fjords, and there's currently only 7 individuals left. When first identified in March 1984, they were 22 animals, but after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, that population declined. But these two populations actually do not interact, and they're actually genetically distinct. The third population we have here is what we call the West Coast transients. And the West Coast transients are the ones that you're likely to see off the Oregon coast. And we are now starting to believe there's at least 2 populations, or 2 assemblages, we call our communities, within this West Coast transient community that basically spans from Southeast Alaska all the way down the Southern California coast. And one is a coastal community that stays close to shore. They feed on harbor seals, sea lions. And then we have what we believe to be an outer coast community, which will be mostly the focus of this presentation, that spends most of their time near the continental shelf break and in deeper waters, but sometimes come into the coastal area as well. Transients kind of got their name from being very transient, initially by Canadian researchers, particularly Michael Bigg, who first identified the different kinds of killer whale, resident and transient. That resident orcas would spend their time in the summer months following the Chinook salmon that came into the inlets and straits. They would be there on a daily basis, where the transients were very much roamers. They would spend their time going from one area to another, and you might not see a pod for years at a time. But now we're starting to see a bit of a change. Transient, they're not so transient anymore, and they're being more frequently sighted in areas, particularly off Vancouver Island and Washington. But my interest in California and Oregon started in 2009. I was on a field survey off of southern Vancouver Island, and we were watching, myself and a research colleague were watching a group of 9 killer whales hunting a California sea lion. And we recognized the whales. They were part of this coastal group. We call them the T99s. And I'll explain a little bit about that ID system shortly here. But we got a radio call from a fisherman that said there was a group of about 40 killer whales actually coming towards us. So we were waiting, hopefully they were just going to see residents, because we don't see an interaction between residents and transients that often. And it ended up actually being more transients. It was one of the largest groups that we had ever seen. And in particular, this male here stood out. He was with one other female, and we were photographing these animals to try to identify them, similar to, as I explained earlier, with the saddle patch and the dorsal fin, and these features here that are unique, like this large chunk that's out of his fin. And he got the nickname Can Opener. We didn't know who this male was at the time. So we spent about 2 months trying to figure out who he was, and we finally learned that he was an animal that was most frequently sighted off the California coast. And from that on in, I wanted to know more about the population elsewhere outside of Washington and BC to really understand the overall range and habitat use of transient killer whales. And in particular, in the open ocean. The open ocean is a very interesting ecosystem that's probably the less known of all the marine ecosystems on our planet, or marine biomes. In particular, in areas where the open ocean can be what we call oligotrophic or nutrient poor, in some areas where the ocean is basically a vast desert. And killer whales do inhabit all the world's oceans. But what are they doing in these open ocean habitats is the big question. So currently we teamed up with NOAA and during ship-based surveys to try to collect more information about these killer whales in these areas. So we did some review work, though, and one of the first studies actually looked at this coastal outer coast assemblage was conducted by Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada in 2013, using sighting information to look at critical habitat for transients off the British Columbia coast in response to a recovery report for Coswick and Sarah, which is the Species at Risk Act, because transients are currently threatened in British Columbia. And what they found through an analysis of habitat use was that there was a coastal and an outer coast group, preferentially individuals that spent time in deeper water, further from shore, that weren't frequently interacting with a coastal group, which you can see in the red here. And the black is this outer coast group, which were occasionally seen in coastal waters. I thought I'd share a little bit about little acoustics. Killer whales rely on acoustics for communication, finding prey, as well as navigation. And transient killer whales in particular use acoustics for socializing, but when they're actually hunting, or most of the time traveling, they remain fairly quiet. And it's because they're marine mammal prey, like seals and sea lions can easily pick them up and hear them, and they lose the element of surprise. But transient killer whales, particularly in these coastal and outer coast group, do have different sounds. This is what we call a sonograph, which is basically a measurement of acoustics. This is one of these pulse calls, which is a particular call. Transients have about 6 to 7 of these in the coastal population. This was a recording we had when we were documenting a group of transients off of Monterey, California, hunting a gray whale calf. But I'll share a little vocal here for you, see if this you can hear this. So that there's a group of coastal transients that might have happened after that recording may have happened during a predation event or after a predation event. And that's when we usually start to hear these vocals when they're socializing after a successful kill. But the outer coast transients, here's a recording was taken at the Clayoquot Canyon. That's off of West Coast Vancouver Island. And you can kind of hear a bit different, it's a little bit more fainter, but you can hear they're a little higher pitched.
Gosh, I'm not hearing anything of that acoustic sample. Either of those.
So the vocalizations can be a little different with the different groups that we've been finding preliminarily with recordings of the outer coast transients that the frequency is a little higher. And that may be due to trying to communicate over the open ocean roar of the waves, where transient vocals are quite low frequency. So having to produce higher frequency vocalization might be more beneficial for communication. But other than that, though, we went down the coast after that initial interaction with those transient killer whales off Vancouver Island. We wanted to know more about them, and we decided to stop into different areas along the Oregon and California coast to either view from shore, talk to naturalists and people that were in the wildlife expeditions and whale watching. And we stopped in. This is probably a place that most people are familiar with, the Whale Watching Center in Depot Bay, Oregon. That's a spectacular place to view gray whales from shore during their northbound migration. And we were able to make a fairly good relationship with a lot of the naturalists in discussing sending in sightings to our research and collecting information, as well as there's a lot of posters for information on resident killer whales off the outer coast that NOAA Northwest Fisheries out of Seattle has along different areas to really try to get that citizen science data that might be beneficial for tracking killer whales. But as we ended up in Monterey, we teamed up with a group called Marine Life Studies for the last 5 years, which is a nonprofit, a great nonprofit that is focused on marine mammal conservation, research, and education. And we conducted field surveys with them. We would go out on a daily basis to collect data on a number of species, from humpback whales, Rizzo's dolphins, killer whales, blue whales, but particularly the 5 years that we were conducting fieldwork was dedicated to killer whales. In particular, that was very little information that was published on the killer whales in the California-Oregon region. So what did we find? I thought I'd share some initial information about the Oregon coast. What a lot of people don't realize is that killer whales are found off Oregon. I've talked to many fishermen that say they just don't see them that frequently, but they are there. And sometimes it's more difficult because the Oregon coast can be kind of remote in certain areas, or the weather can be quite rough, and it's difficult to get viewings of them. But we've been finding that the more we've reached out to locals, the more we're learning about killer whales in the area. So before we started this study, we kind of looked at an initial study by Green et al. 1992 that did an aerial survey work up and down the coast to try to look at the different populations of cetacean that inhabit the outer coast of Washington and Oregon. And it was really kind of a focus for gray whales, but at the same time, they were able to at least record a number of different killer whale groups, about 24 different groups. And what was really interesting about this was that from talking with the author, most of the whales were not recognizable or matched to killer whales in Washington and British Columbia. So there were groups of transients or killer whales that were unknown or not part of that population that we frequently see in coastal waters. So we built a sightings network the last few years. And if you haven't seen it, I'll put it in the chat, but there is a group called the Oregon Coast Killer Whale Sightings Group. We formed it about a year ago, and it's now up to close to 1,500 members, and we've started to build quite a database that would spiked our sightings. And you can see here, this is a map of the Oregon coast, basically from Astoria down to the California border. And you can see the different color codes here. The red is the coastal transient, so that's that coastal west coast. for us to really distinguish a killer whale, we need to have a good photograph where we can ID the animal, either to a transient or to individual. And then you can see kind of an unknown. Unknown is what we believe to be transient, presumed, but unfortunately we couldn't identify the animal to the population. And you can kind of see that in the gray. And then you can see the yellow here is this outer coast group, these outer coast transients, which are seen predominantly more in the offshore waters. And then the blue here is really interesting, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But these are what we believe to be oceanic, which are a group of killer whales that we don't really have too much information, but they have been identified predating marine mammals and found quite seaward of the continental shelf, and are different from the offshore killer whales that I mentioned earlier, because when encountered, they look similar to transients, and they were predating marine mammals. So with most of the group sizes we've been documenting off Oregon, the average has been about 4 or 5. And in transient killer whales, the common group size can be anywhere between 1 to 12. And transients live in these matrilineal systems, when a matriline is basically a mother and her offspring. And these families typically stay with each other for their lives, but often there might be just some dispersal of individuals when they hit sexual maturity. And that's usually around about 14 to 15 years of age. While on average, this group size is about 4 to 5 compared to the resident killer whales, which I mentioned earlier, it could be around 25 animals. And this group size is typically in relation to their foraging strategies and diet. By staying in smaller family groups, they're able to use the element of surprise and be able to sneak up on their prey, and as well as using coordination while hunting, that synergistic behavior of hunting. I split up the map here to show you kind of the areas of Oregon a little bit, so you can have more of a spatial view. But a lot of the transient killer whales end up entering into these little areas, these little fjords or inland waterways off the Oregon coast. And typically, especially the coastal and the red, are looking for harbor seals. They're specialists of harbor seals. And here's a photograph of a coastal transient we know as T49C. And you can kind of see he's got 2 big notches. He's been spending actually quite a bit of time off the Oregon coast the last few years. And we've had multiple reports of him off Newport and off of Seal Rock and Depot Bay. He's been moving back and forth. He kind of spends most of his time on his own. He's a bit of a nomad. But what they're doing is they're actually searching for their favorite prey. The coastal population has been identified to predominantly feed on these little rock sausages or orca hors d'oeuvres we call harbor seals. And harbor seals are the most abundant marine mammal species in the Pacific Northwest. And each year they have this decline in the population where it kind of changes throughout the season. You can kind of see, depending where you are geographically, the harbor seal pupping season. So when they start to have their pups, which are the target of most transient killer whales, or the easy to hunt pups, is dependent on the location. So off Vancouver Island in Washington State, we see a pupping season that starts in about mid-July and ends in September. But as you head south, though, towards California, that pupping season gets gradually earlier. And off Oregon coast, it's in May and June. And in California, it can be even March, April. And as you go further north, though, along the southeast Alaska coast, it can be May, June, and it gets earlier again. So there's this decline in the population pupping season for harbor seals. So one of the things we found interesting was that there has been studies done in British Columbia, particularly by Robin Baird and Lawrence Dill in the 1990s, that were able to link seasonality of transient killer whales, so their site fidelity or spending time in an area to the harbor seal pupping season. And that was interesting. And those were the months, like I said, July through September. But from our preliminary data, what we did find with transient killer whales was a spike in May and June around that pupping season that's occurring off the Oregon coast at around this time. So, and also we're noticing different groups of transients that aren't frequently sighted in BC and Washington that are sighted off the Oregon coast. So one of the things we've kind of teamed up with is with a couple of scientists, researchers from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, who are particularly involved in the population stock assessments of harbor seals. And one of the things was kind of mapping out where the majority of killer whale and harbor seal hollowed sites are. And you can see here, these are the hollowed sites just on the B panel here. And there's quite a few harbor seal haulets just along the coast. They like these exposed rocky areas, these outer coast fringing reefs. And then you can see the killer whales as well. The predominantly, there's that map again. And we put a kind of a heat map over this to see, where the more abundant harbor seals were found. And you can kind of see the harbor seals were quite abundant in areas just kind of south here towards the southern Oregon coast. But also there was quite an overlap with killer whales all along here with transients, presumed transients and transients all along this coastal area. You can kind of see here, this is a group of transients, coastal transients, we know is the T50s. And what's really neat is they're real specialists that hunt in coastal areas. So they can be found really close to the haul out sites. This rocky area is a perfect spot for a harbor seal or a sea lion to be hauled out to rest or molt or give birth. And the transients will often kind of sneak in and out of these areas quite stealthily, hunting the kelp beds, looking for harbor seal pups that may have been practicing their swims, as harbor seals are actually one of the earliest of the seal species to actually take their young into the water in the first 2 to 3 weeks. And the killer whales will often spend their time in these little craggy areas looking for prey. They'll be quite close. So I apologize for the music there. A fisherman was nice enough to send us this video clip of a group of transients last year that were hunting along quite close to the rocks for some harbor seal pups. So one of the things that came from this study was trying to really understand more about the population. The first kind of census or work, photo ID work that was conducted on transient killer whales off the California coast was in 1997. They discovered there was about 105 unique transient killer whales were found in that area. But since then, there hasn't been an updated catalog or study of any of the killer whales. So we expanded that to California and Oregon, and we produced a recent publication that encompassed 13 years of data. So what did we do? We formed alliances and colleagues with colleagues at NOAA's Southwest Fisheries Science Center and Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and they were on ship-based surveys collecting data on killer whales, particularly quite far offshore. We conducted our own focal follow behavioral studies, and then also we collaborated with whale watchers in Monterey and throughout the Oregon coast to collect this data, as well as citizen science photographs from people like yourselves that might be tuning in or looking for whales during the summer and spring. So our study encompassed quite a range. It was from Astoria all the way down to Point Conception, California, and extended out to 560 kilometers from shore, quite seaward of the continental shelf. And most of our field work, though, was strictly in the Monterey, California region, which I'll discuss a little bit later. But you can see most of the sightings came from there. During this time, though, we after doing a lot of the field work, we would also spend time at a lab. We'd work at an area called the Moss Landing Marine Laboratories out of San Jose State University. They're just in Central California, close to Monterey Bay, and they have a beautiful setup. They were very nice enough to provide us time and access to their libraries and resources. And we'd spend 8 hours a day doing analysis and looking over hundreds of photos. We actually looked over 113,000 photographs, encompassing that 13 years of data collection. And kind of what did we find? So what's really interesting is we found that there was a total of 150 individual killer whales we photo identified between 2006 and 2018. And we encountered them 146 times. There was 146 encounters. And to get this process going, the identification system, which was developed by Michael Bigg and his colleagues at Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, we decided to take each photograph of each whale and we'd give them an identifier, an alphanumeric identifier. So you can see this OCT letter system means outer coast transient. And then the number right here would be the 30th animal. So this would be the 30th animal. Her name's OCT 30. Her common name is named Emma. She's quite distinctive. She has this little scarring here. And then we'd also, if she had an offspring, or an offspring would be OCT30A, and the second offspring would be OCT30B. Now, if OCT30B, her daughter, was to have an offspring, it would be B1. And this is kind of how we track the individuals and families. And through this, we found that 30 different family groups, mothers and offspring, were in this population study. And since then, since this study was published in 2021, we're now up to 180 whales. So during the photo ID process, it was really interesting. So we have the number of years photo identified on the x-axis at the bottom here, and then on the y-axis you have the number of individuals. So on a given within 1 year, we'd photo identify at least 60 to 65 individuals. But there were some individuals, around 10 individuals, that would only been 10 years for one individual that was resighted. So that was quite a gap in being able to photograph certain individuals, and this some animals disperse from the area or move on. Throughout the study period, though, we did find that we saw new individuals throughout the year. So on the x-axis here is the year that whales were encountered, and then the cumulative number of photo identified whales is on the y-axis. And continually throughout the study period, we got this almost linear increase in the number of animals that we discovered in our study. So the population structure is really interesting in killer whales. It's very unique, and it's the fact that you have a matrilineal system, this female and her offspring. So similar to elephants, but the only difference, and especially in the resident killer whale population, is that the males don't leave their mother. They often stay with their families for their lives. But in transients, we sometimes see dispersal of individuals. So for instance, this is Emma. She's the matriarch of the family, the OCT30 matriline. This is her presumed brother, OCT60. Now her offspring, so here's her offspring here. This is her oldest daughter, and her oldest daughter now has 2 young ones. So these would be Emma's grandchildren. And then Emma has another son and another offspring here as well. So you can kind of follow these family matrilines throughout their life, which is, it's quite spectacular. And we can get complete census work, look at mortality rates of populations, as well as birth rates. And as I mentioned with the photo ID work, we can also keep track of the individual whales as they grow. This was an animal named OCT44C, or Bumper. He's predominantly seen off the California coast with his family, but we first got photographs of him in 2006. And then through time, you can kind of see the development of the male dorsal fin compared to females. If I go back a slide, you can kind of see the female dorsal fins very much smaller, shorter, where the male has this very large fin. Female dorsal fins can be around 3 feet. Males can be up to about 6 feet. And males go through this phase of puberty or sexual maturity around 14 or 15 years of age when they start to sprout that dorsal fin. But you can see he started to sprout it here as time goes, and now he's quite a senior bull here in 2019. From this study, though, we're the open ocean, we're learning so much more about killer whales in this really remote habitat. But what we found was that we have these outer coast transients, as I mentioned, that feed on marine mammals and live offshore. We also have these offshore killer whales, which are more fish-eating specialists. But the one thing that stood out was this group that we've identified 40 whales, and we call outer coasts, or oceanics. This population of that we're currently looking at, we're not sure where they really fit in, if they're transient or if they're their own population. We haven't been able to link them through association to transients, so none of them have been seen to mingle with known transient killer whales we've identified, or any other population. We weren't able to match them to any ID database. This male right here was sighted 307 kilometers off the California coast, off Oregon, off of Monterey, and they were feeding on an unidentified cetacean species. And you can see the black-footed albatross were flocking around and picking up scraps, scavenging off the kill. That was a group of 4. What's really unique about these whales is that they have these interesting markings on their saddle patches and dorsal fins. And it's really only found in individuals that spend time in the open ocean. And these are what the leftover scars from a mesopelagic predator called, or parasite called the cookie cutter shark. Now, cookie cutter sharks are only found in deep, warm, deep waters in the open ocean, and that shows a little bit of where these killer whales might be spending their time in open water. And the first real identification of these oceanic killer whales was in a publication by NOAA colleagues in 1997. They identified a group of about 34 killer whales attacking a group of sperm whales off the central California coast. And that was kind of one of the first things that was published on these oceanics, and those whales were not able to be matched to any known killer whales. So we're still learning new things about killer whales in the open ocean, new groups of whales, and it's an exciting time for us. At the end of this, though, we were able to publish a recent catalog. It's free. It's a government catalog through NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center. It's access to the public. You can find a download of it. I can share that with you as well. It has an ID catalog of all the killer whales that you might see if you're on the water photographing, or if you're on a fishing trip and you might come across them, you take a photograph, and you might be able to identify them. So just to skip into the California region, California is very much a special place for killer whales, and a lot of these outer coast transients spend their time in this area that we call the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. We also call it the Monterey and Pacific Transition Ecoregion. So it's a large area that's very, very productive. It has upwelling currents, seasonal upwelling, where nutrients are brought up from deep waters to the surface, where it feeds phytoplankton. It also has this amazing canyon system called the Monterey Submarine Canyon that bisects the bay right through the middle and goes quite a ways offshore. And it brings a very oceanic pelagic ecosystem very close to shore, because this canyon goes within 5 miles of Moss Landing, and it can be quite deep, 4,000 to 5,000 meters. You can kind of see up here too, you got this large California current that comes down the coast from basically southern Vancouver Island all the way down to California. And you have these different areas where a lot of people spend their time whale watching and looking for wildlife along the coast. So sightings are a little bit different. We see a bit of a transition. This continental shelf off of California, as you go head down from Oregon to California, it starts to narrow. And the continental shelf narrows all the way into Monterey, where that canyon is. So we're starting to see a bit of a difference in habitat use. We don't see the coastal transients as frequently. So the red one here, where those transients have spent a lot of their time near the coast hunting seals. But we're starting to see more of these outer coast transients that from our sightings network and through our publication, we note from our catalog, we noticed a lot of these animals spent their time in deeper water and near the continental shelf edge. And then also the occasional oceanic whale. And you can kind of see here's that Monterey Canyon in more greater detail. You can kind of see it kind of branching into the open here, and where the majority of the sightings are. So a lot of the transients in Monterey would notice a seasonal distribution, and their foraging is a lot different. Now, these are two males that were traveling along the open ocean waves. Typically, they will use this canyon system here to hunt. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a second here. But first off, the seasonality. Through all our sightings, we notice a seasonal difference in the killer whales, similar to the Oregon coast. But for Monterey and off the central coast of California, we see a spike in sightings in around April, May, June, and then another spike in the fall, even though killer whale sightings are throughout the year. Here's an underwater video I thought I'd share. It shows 2 transient killer whales in Monterey hunting. And that was taken from a colleague at Marine Life Studies, Stephanie Marcos. But diet for killer whales in off the California coast is a little different. From what we see, the majority of predation events we witness are on California sea lions, but also gray whale calves, and very much less on harbor seals, which are more frequently targeted for the coastal assemblage that we see off Washington and British Columbia. So gray whale calves are the predominant prey with California sea lions. The difference being that gray whale calves seem to be only targeted in the spring period, and that's where this seasonal peak here kind of corresponds with that northbound migration, where gray whale calves are starting to come up the coast with their mothers in the spring around April, May. They're moving their way north. Oops. So yeah, as I mentioned, gray whales right now, we're kind of getting into that season. We're going to start to see gray whales off the Oregon coast and California coast. They're migrating north. Often it's the males and non-reproductive females that are making their way up first. And then the females with calves kind of are the last latecomers to head up the coast. And they will make their way up this 18,000 kilometer journey to the Arctic Ocean, unless it's part of a special population called the Pacific Feeding Group, which spend their entire summers off of Oregon, Washington, and BC. But this was a photograph taken from Big Sur, where this mother and calf are actually hugging the shoreline within the kelp forest. They use the kelp forest for protection from predators like killer whales, and they spend their time really close to the shore. But as they enter Monterey Bay, that deep water canyon, we've noticed a lot of the times that instead of following the coast around the canyon, they cut right across the middle. And that's either because the females, as they're moving north, are trying to expend as less energy as possible. Remember that calf is also a few months old, and it's trying to save its energy as well. So they risk it by going right across the cut across as a shortcut. And as they do that, a lot of these transient groups will frequent Monterey during April, May, and they'll intercept these gray whale calves, and it ends up being quite an amazing hunt. Sometimes 6 hours in length that transients will spend their time hunting. First off, the behavior is really interesting. You'll see transients will actually keep pace with the mother and calf. And this might last an hour to 2 hours, where they'll try to wear out the mother and calf. The calf might get too tired, can't keep up with its mother. And then as that happens, they'll try to separate the mom and calf. And this is a photograph here. Once the calf is separated, the transients will often resort to ramming the calf's head, trying to breach on top of the gray whale calf, trying to submerge, trying to drown it. Here's another photograph here by Marine Life Studies. It shows a female here ramming the head of a gray whale calf. And one of the observations we found is that during these predation events, that the ramming of the head, we often see gray whale calves with a lot of blood coming from the mouth. And that can either be the killer whales trying to either break the jaw of the gray whale, so it makes it more difficult to breathe, making it more difficult to lift its head. There's also a lot of arteries in the lower jaw, and also the fact that in some areas of the world, killer whales have been known to actually predate and eat only the tongue and lips of large whales. But in Monterey, we see kind of a mix. Sometimes killer whales will eat the lower jaw and tongue, and often other times we see carcasses being fed on for days, sometimes 2 to 3 days. Here's, for instance, a gray whale calf that was killed the previous day, and as we return, this killer whale was still feeding on this carcass. And they'll kind of share it, they'll split it apart, and this could last for quite a while. So seasonally, though, diet does shift. As mentioned, gray whale calves are only predated upon in the springtime as they move up the north, up north from their northbound migration. But gray whales have an annual migration, a semi-annual migration, where they'll move up the coast during the spring, and then in the winter they'll head back down the coast to their breeding lagoons in the tropics in Mexico. And we have never witnessed any predation events during the southbound migration in the winter. And this is likely because gray whale calves have gained enough energy, they've been able to get enough food when they're in the feeding grounds, and the fact that it may be more difficult for the transients to actually hunt. But sea lion definitely makes up the majority of predation events. In lesser extent, some of these other prey, like some of these oceanic dolphins, like common dolphin, and as well as other dolphin species like Pacific whitesides, and minke whales and Dall's porpoise. The unknown here is occasionally we see carcasses, or we see tissue in the water after predation events already happened, and we arrived on scene too late. But we know there was a predation event because often there's either oil slick on the surface, or there's birds like gulls and albatross that are flying down and picking up pieces from the surface. but we weren't able to identify the prey. Even though it's kind of sad to think about, but these dramatic hunts on gray whale calves may actually provide an ecosystem service. And ecologically, gray whale calves provide thousands of kilograms of living tissue, biological tissue, to the bottom of these canyon systems, like the Monterey Canyon, deep down, where there isn't a lot of food available. But there's all interesting, unique ecosystems down there that rely on these whale falls or for prey that drift down to the bottom to be fed upon. So for instance, you've got a Pacific sleeper shark here, which is a deep water species, hagfish, different types of crabs and amphipods, isopods, and they will feed on these carcasses for months. The Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute actually kind of led some of the research on whale falls. And they would conduct these studies where they would look over the years at the decomposition process of large cetaceans like a gray whale that may drift to the bottom, like this gray whale here. And what's one of the most interesting findings I found was that on these carcasses, there's species of marine worm that are only found on whale bones and whale falls, and found nowhere else. And one of the most recent studies has found that some of these deep sea whale falls might actually link the same species of worms across the world's oceans. But sometimes we get the opportunity to actually view some of these predation, leftover predation events or carcasses of gray whales, like this animal here that washed up in Monterey. And killer whales often leave these quite nasty rake marks. And you can also sometimes see some of the issues through a necropsy, how the animal died, what areas the killer whales targeted. Similar to the coastal transients and the group sizes that I showed you a few slides ago, we see whale hunting in California and Monterey, we see the same kind of thing. We see about 5 to 6 individuals on average, especially for a matriline. On occasion, though, we do get these larger groups or multiple families that will form to hunt, in particular with gray whale calves. We'll have 20 to 25 individuals. Other species, though, that are targeted also range from outside the spring season, can be Pacific white-sided dolphins, Dall's porpoises, and sea lions. And here's a video clip we took of a sea lion our team took at Marine Life Studies, showing a sea lion being hunted by a few transients. I won't get into the nitty-gritty of it, but the sea lion did not make it. But it was an interesting hunt to watch. And with pinniped populations, one of the big concerns, I'll leave this off with my last thoughts on this presentation, is that in the last few years, there's been concern about pinnipeds, especially seals and sea lions, targeting commercially important fish like salmon. And the fact that the resident killer whales that rely on salmon are in competition. But with the seals and sea lions, the important thing to take from this is that the population increase in both have been actually supporting the increase in the transient population, as they're the main predators. If you're more, but that's I think the end of my presentation here. I hope you enjoyed. If you have more information, though, if you want to learn more about killer whales, you can visit the University of British Columbia's Institute for the Ocean Fisheries Marine Mammal Research Unit on Facebook. Also the Transient Killer Whale Research Project on Facebook. If you have any reports you want to share a sighting, as well as a few different organizations as well. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Josh. A lot of great information, and we have a handful of questions. So I'll start off with the first one. Leah asked, have any orcas ever been tagged?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, there has been tagging done. Depending on the kind of tag, there's been some with what's called satellite tags, others with D tags, which are suction cup tags. With the satellite tags, there was quite an initiative about 10 years ago on southern resident killer whales, where they were tagging them to try to understand their movements off the Oregon coast and offshore waters, especially outside the summer period where it's difficult to get to whales in rough weather conditions, in particular the open ocean areas. So yeah, the southern residents were part of a large tagging initiative that provided tremendous data on their movement patterns along the Oregon and Washington coast.
Okay, awesome. And then Rachel asked, how do we think the new wind farms will impact the whale migrations? Will the noise and or the base placements be too much for the whales, for their food sources? Will the continued noises impact their ability to communicate and navigate?
You know, with wind farms, it's a great question. I think we're kind of at the early stages of understanding some of this new technology and how it affects marine mammals. Even though it's a great initiative for solar energy and going towards sustainable, clean energy systems, it does have the potential to hurt marine mammals. Anything that's in their habitat that makes noise or potentially can disrupt their migration route, there is always that potential. I think in general, especially with we're starting to learn more about boat noise, for instance, on killer whales. We're learning that boat noise can have a significant impact on the foraging success of resident killer whales. And if you think, as I mentioned, transients rely on being cryptic. They rely on staying silent. And they often, and for transients, it might even be worse if they're not able to find their prey by listening for splashing seals or sea lions. So I think there needs to be more research in that area, especially because this technology is so new.
Okay, and then Carrie asked, do offshore killer whales follow the gray whale migration either north or south?
So the offshore killer whales, as I mentioned, it gets kind of confusing. I was trying to explain it as best as I could. The offshore killer whales are actually this population that feeds predominantly on what we believe fish and sharks. The outer coast transients, though, maybe that's what you're more referring to, the ones that were the primary focus of this presentation, we believe may follow them north. And what's really interesting, if anybody in Oregon might have photographs of killer whales attacking gray whales, we know there's some out there that people have mentioned seeing killer whales attack gray whales, but we've never been able to match any of the individuals that were involved in the gray whale predations off Oregon. And what we don't know is if the killer whales that are doing the attacks off Oregon are part of the outer coast group that we see predominantly off California that might be moving north, or are they part of the coastal group that feeds predominantly on seals and are close to shore. But the thing is, the ones that focus off the coastal group don't typically target gray whales. They're harbor seal hunters. So, and small pinnipeds in British Columbia and Washington, that's what we see them feeding on mostly. So it'd be really interesting to see if we can figure out which killer whales are actually attacking the gray whales off the outer coast. So if anybody has photographs, I'd love to hear from you and see if we can figure out who they are.
Okay. And then Eric asked, sorry, something popped up. Is there any distinct genetic differences between oceanic and coastal killer whale populations?
It's a great question. So currently, we do know that the offshore form that eats sharks and fish, we do know they're genetically distinct from residents and transient killer whales. So that's the third ecotype. But in the transient, like the oceanic, we have no idea. Right now, we do know that the outer coast and coastal transients do intermingle. So occasionally we do see the outer coast transients and the coastal transients associating throughout the range, but it's not that common. But that's an opportunity. If they're associating, it's an opportunity for mating, which means there could have similar genetics. But the oceanics, we have no idea anything more about the animals that we're seeing quite far offshore.
Okay, then I think our last question is from Andre, who says, hey, Josh, wondering about when you're out at sea looking into these. How do you know where to find them? Radar, satellite imagery, or just head out and look?
It's a good question. It's honestly head out and look. Unless we've got the fancy satellite tags, which we often don't. It's searching by eye. We often go out and look. We rely on people like yourselves that are out, live in the area that can photograph, or you see them and you want to send an email. Sometimes we go out in our own boat. We have our own boat, Zodiac, that we go out and look on our own, but it's often just out and look on our own. Yeah.
Oh, and then Katie chimed in and said that this afternoon in Manzanita, which is just south of us in Cannon Beach, the orcas were seen moving north. I'm sorry, south, and then grays were moving north. So that's really exciting. I'm gonna have to go out and look tomorrow.
Well, that's great news. Katie, if you're, if anybody's interested, I'll put the link here for you. But I'll give you our Facebook group that anyone can join. It's for anyone in the Oregon region that's interested in tracking whales. And if you want to share that sighting, that is very helpful to us for tracking information. I didn't even know about that sighting, so that's great.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll make sure to put those links in the chat on the Facebook group so everyone gets a chance to see that. And thank you, and you all have a wonderful evening. And check us out next month for our next library lecture. And be sure to be watching the Friends of Haystack Rock Facebook page, as we have lots of events coming up now that it's starting to get sunny and the puffins are coming. So we're excited to see you out at the beach sometime. So have a good evening.
Thank you.